Hey everybody, it's me Ashish, and before we begin, I just want to give a quick thank you to everybody listening, watching, and supporting the podcast. It means the world to us, and we're so appreciative. I just want to let you guys know that you guys can always ask us questions, give us segment ideas, and keep up with the fun, all at AshishandFriends.com. We're on Twitter at AshishandPals, we're on Instagram at AshishandFriends, and hey, we're even on Facebook, facebook.com/AshishandFriendsPod. If you're watching this video, please go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to the channel. All that following and liking and subscribing will help us grow and keep going, so we appreciate it so much. And once again, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Yes, welcome to another great episode of the Ashish and Friends podcast. As always, I'm your host Ashish, and you can catch me on Instagram and on Twitter at Ashish Airy. Of course, I'm joined by my longtime friends and co-hosts. We've got Shahan at Shahan Jayaraja, and we've got Dev at Superlaser. So election day's just right around the corner. First of all, if you haven't voted yet, please get out there and vote. Make sure your family and friends have voted. It's still early voting here in Texas, so get it done. But you know what? Election day is like really approaching, so that's what we're trying to target here. And you know, you can do election day too, but just get it done for sure. So
Right, and I do want to say something really quick there. Like AOC had mentioned on the stream, if you're gonna ask your friends and family to vote, ask them what their voting plan is. Ask them where they're planning to go and when, and that will hopefully get them more motivated to vote.
yeah, there is a website, I think, like Plan to Vote or something, and it's just proven, right? It's science that's saying like if you have the plan to vote and you declare it, you're more likely to vote. So we're just trying to make sure everyone's out there voting.
Yep.
But with election day coming, like there's a lot of questions. You know, a lot of first time people voting, and they don't know exactly how everything works. So we're just going to try to hit, you know, most of the frequently asked questions and other questions me and Dev and Shahan may have, and discuss some of those. So, guys, I'll throw this to Shahan. So, what exactly are we watching on election day, right? Like, how are we watching it? What exactly are we looking for?
Yeah, so obviously we're going to start with the presidential election, right? That's going to be the headliner. Everybody knows Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. I'm sure everybody's heard of those people by now in one way or another. And so the big thing that we're watching for, right, is that, you know, going into this election, there's every state votes differently. And so in order to become president, you know, these might be terms that you're familiar with or have heard of before, but, you know, I think it's good to sort of get a little bit of a rehash and kind of understand what's going on. So in order to win the presidency, you can't just win by getting the most votes. Unfortunately, we figured that out in the year 2016, that America liking you best, in fact, does not help you win the presidency. What you got to do is that when we vote, we're actually voting for a group of electors, and those electors are going to go and actually cast the votes for us in their own separate thing. Now, we don't actually participate in that process or even really see that process, but what it means in practice is that depending on what state you live in, it's a winner take all. So if 50% plus one vote wins Texas, if 50% plus one vote beats, you know, the other side in the state of Texas, even if it's, you know, again, it can be 51-49. It can be super duper close. If the whoever wins gets all of the electors from that state. So, for example, in Texas, I want to say that there's like 38 electoral votes.
There is 38.
Yes. 38. So, for example, right, historically, like we're talking since, I think it's since LBJ or maybe Jimmy Carter, right? Like every single year, those have gone to Republicans, even though, you know, and this is kind of the funny thing that people don't realize, right, is that outside of Texas, the state with the most Republican voters in America is California. And you flip it around, and it's Texas, right? There are a ton of Democratic voters in Texas who obviously their voice doesn't get heard because they don't make up more than half of the electorate. So what you're going to be looking for, first of all, is, you know, in your own state. For us, that's Texas. For other people watching, it might be other states. You're looking to see whether your candidate wins a majority. And I think just a plurality is good enough. A plurality of the votes in that state. And then your state's electors will be allocated to that presidential candidate.
And
so,
to go there, if you are curious how many electors your state has, that's going to be it's not the same, but the elector total is your number of representatives plus your 2 senators. So in
Right.
case anyone is curious about why that number exists, why is Texas
Right.
38?
Right. And so here's the thing, right? Most of the time, most states in America go one direction, right? So Texas historically has been a Republican stronghold. California traditionally is a Democratic stronghold, right? Like basically, the Republican candidate doesn't even really campaign in California. Even though the most people in America live in that state, the Republican candidate doesn't even bother campaigning, and the Democrat usually doesn't bother campaigning. So what usually happens is that you have these safe states, right, where everybody kind of just assumes that it's going to go one way. And the race is really decided in these swing states, right? And so swing states are places where the margin of error is close enough that you feel like maybe it can go one way or another. Like traditionally, the two states that we've heard a lot about from that perspective have been Florida and Ohio. Those are the two that you hear about the most. But, I think that sometimes people get in the mindset that this is permanent, right? Like this is always going to be this way. And 2020 is a good example of the fact that that's not the case. So in the year 2020, you look at the polls, you look at the margins of error, Texas is a swing state right now, right? It could go either way. In fact, Kamala Harris is coming to campaign in Texas on October 30th, which I guess will have passed by the time this podcast comes out. We're seeing Democratic candidates actually come to the state of Texas, to the state of Georgia, to the state of Arizona, and now the big swing states are really Florida and Pennsylvania. Those are the two that you really need to be watching the closest, because if Joe Biden were to win the state of Pennsylvania and the state of Florida and also the state of North Carolina, you can throw in there, the election's basically over, right? Because that would mean that based on what we know and what we think is going to happen, Donald Trump doesn't have a path to get to a majority of electoral college votes. And you have to get to 270 electoral college votes one way or another. So it's a little bit of a complicated system. And, just to go into it just a little briefly, the reason that they wanted to do this, right? The reason that the founders put this in, and we can have arguments about whether it's still relevant in the year 2020, obviously. The big part of the reason is that, one, they wanted states to have power, right? They wanted states over people to have power. And on top of that, there was a thought at the time that, well, if you have a presidential election and somebody lives in Georgia, right, and the candidates are mostly up there in New York and Virginia and whatever, right, like obviously campaigning in the year 1787 does not look like campaigning in the year 2020. So part of the thought was, well, how could somebody in the state of Georgia have enough knowledge about the people who are being elected in order to have this conversation, right? Now, obviously, we've got a completely different world now where everybody knows every little detail about everything that Donald Trump and Joe Biden have ever done. So there's a good case, obviously, for moving past the system. But for right now, this is the system that we have. And you might think, right, like based on the electoral college votes, that means that certain states have more power than others. So, for example, in the state of California, your vote is only worth 1/3 as much based on electoral college as the state of Wyoming, right? That's kind of crazy. That's something that's still going on today, but that's something that we're working with within the system. So it's a little bit complicated. It's a little esoteric. It's supposed to be. It's built that way because the founders didn't want us to actually elect the president, but that's what we're working with right now.
Right, and you mentioned that 270 number. What's the total number of electoral? Is it exactly half?
So that's half plus one. So the total number is 538. So it is in fact possible to tie. And then that triggers a whole bunch of other stuff that I don't even really know all the background of. But so you have to get 270 because that's more than half.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so 270 is the number to look at. Like Sean mentioned, Texas, the state we live in, right? Texas, that's a swing state, something to look at, in a big way. Somewhere else, like Arizona as well, some Republican stronghold as well, might swing. So, Sean's told us in the past some of these swing states, and I think that's something very interesting to watch.
Is that why the website's called 538?
It is. If you've heard of the media outlet 538.com, it's because there are 538 electors. And there's another website called 270towin.com, which actually allows you to kind of go in and make your own electoral maps and it'll count basically. So that's what those those two things are based off.
Which is funny because I saw 538 for the first time and it was like sports stats,
Yeah.
you
So
know.
I always associated 538 with sports.
Yeah,
I
right.
never
I never
once
thought about it.
associated it with the president.
This is a little embarrassing. I didn't think about it until this point right here. But you know, like Sean said, most states, right? Whoever gets a majority of the electoral votes, right? Like that's all that matters. Whoever gets the majority, that's who the votes go to. I think Maine and Nebraska are the only two states that actually like split them based on proportion. So that's still pretty interesting. And like Sean touched on, usually this has been like whoever wins the popular vote has won the electoral vote, but 2 of the past 5 elections, that has not been the case. So maybe that's something we can look down the road to. So Shahan, you mentioned, you know, a nice pathway, you know, some states that could flip and get you to 270. But like, there's a lot going on during election day and a lot of coverage going on. Sometimes they throw out a lot of terms we're not aware of, you know? I'm wondering if we can kind of like touch on some of those terms.
Yeah. Well, one of them, you know, that you kind of mentioned was pathway to victory, right? And so what that means is that, you know, there are only 2 people, obviously, who are really running for president. There are other third-party candidates, but for a variety of reasons that, trust me, I can spend hours on getting into, obviously, to kind of rise to the top, right? And so what you're looking for is you're trying to figure out what is the coalition that you're building going to look like, right? And so historically, for example, you know, for Republicans, the Republicans have held on to the South, right? The South has been strong Republican country. I'm not going to say always because obviously there's a lot of history there, but in terms of like post 2000, it's been the South, it's been the state of Texas, it's been a lot of the Great Plains region where you're getting Montana and Wyoming and all those sort of states, Kansas, Iowa. Those have usually been strong states.
North Dakota, baby.
Both of the Dakotas, of course. And for Democrats, it's really been the West Coast. It's usually been the Midwest because of union workers, and union workers have historically gone Democratic because the Democrats have been a much stronger party for workers' rights and union issues historically. And then the Northeast as well has usually been a strong Democratic area. And like I mentioned, you know, historically, the real swing states have been Florida and Ohio, and you know, and Virginia has been at certain times, but really especially Florida and Ohio between like 2000 and 2016. And so what happened in 2016 and the way that we knew something was up and something was going to be different was that all of a sudden, out of basically nowhere, Michigan and Pennsylvania flipped. Those were not states that anybody really expected to not be safe Democratic states. And when, you know, you might hear all this coverage about Pennsylvania, and Michigan, you know, white Midwesterner, all this stuff, right? You might keep hearing all this stuff and you might wonder, well, what the hell? Like, there's so many different people in America. Why do we just keep talking about white working class Midwesterners? It's because that's the demographic that flipped in the last election.
And it was the labor unions, right, that flipped? From what I understand.
A lot of the people who were former union workers who, you know, obviously a lot of those jobs have been decimated just because the economy is changing. And I mean, again, it's just
we're moving from
situation.
manufacturing.
Right. And that's a tough situation. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and judge anybody for feeling scared or feeling like, you know, whatever, because it is obviously a difficult time to be that kind of worker in America. But that has been a group that has historically gone blue. And in 2016, it went red. And so, you know, so for example, right, the moment that we knew that this is happening, this is a real thing that's happening, wasn't when Florida or Ohio flipped. It was when Pennsylvania flipped. Because once Pennsylvania flipped, it was all of a sudden, oh, there is no way, based on the coalitions that they've tried to build, that Hillary Clinton could get to 270 votes. And all of a sudden it was, oh, okay, well, Donald Trump not only hit all the targets he needed to hit historically, but he also prevented any of the ways that Hillary Clinton can get to 270 electoral college votes.
Right.
And
she lost her pathway to victory.
Right. And so, you know, what that means, and sometimes things go crazy, right? Like sometimes, and I think in this election is going to be really interesting because, you know, all of the candidates are going to count on getting Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota is going to be in play, Florida is going to be in play, North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Those are kind of the biggest ones. But we could see all of a sudden that maybe Florida goes red and Ohio goes red, but Texas goes blue. Maybe, you know, Pennsylvania goes red and Michigan and Wisconsin go blue. We really don't know. You know, this is one of the more unsure elections in terms of pathway to victory I think we've ever seen. And actually transitioning to another issue with that is that I think that this is going to be an election where it's going to be very unclear. There's not going to be an obvious point where it's like, we need to concede because we lost, right? I think that this is going to be a very interesting election for that reason.
So real quickly, we're all watching TV. We're watching like CNN or whatever, and they're saying, "Hey, we're projecting this candidate to win this state." What's the difference between projection? How are they coming up with that versus declaring them like a candidate as the winner?
Yeah, when they call it, right? They say they called the state. What is the process of calling a state?
For sure. So the way that process works is that, when you hear that somebody has been declared president, in terms of by like CNN or by the Associated Press or whatever, that's before every vote is counted, right? And so actually, to get kind of into a different thing, there's a lot of talk right now about President Trump kind of saying this needs to be done on election day, right? Like we shouldn't have to wait to know who's going to be president. And the funny thing about that, obviously, is that historically that's an absurd statement. We've never been able to count every vote by that point. So the way that it works is, and so I'd say that the safest outlet to use would be the Associated Press, but really any outlet, they're taking it very seriously. They're not going to make a call until they're like really, really, really sure that something's going to happen. But we won't have every vote until maybe a week or two afterwards, right? Like that just won't happen. So what does happen is, in all of these newsrooms, in the Fox News newsroom and the CNN newsroom and the Associated Press, et cetera, New York Times, whatever, they're looking and they are gathering data based on the votes that are coming in, and they're seeing basically when do we reach a critical mass where we know what's going to happen, right? And so what that means, and that's a very complicated process. That takes a lot of experts. That takes a lot of political scientists. That takes a lot of people who do elections for a living to analyze the data before they can make that declaration. So, for example, some of these states, like as soon as they close, they'll project them, right? Like, so for example, Wyoming's not in risk of flipping at all, right? Like nobody's really questioning whether Wyoming's going to go red or blue. It's going to go red. So
it's going to go birthday.
No, it's good. So basically, as soon as that poll closes, they'll just say, "This is over with," basically, right? And it'll be a similar deal. They'll wait a little bit longer on like a California, but I mean, it largely they'll just kind of wait to see. Okay, nothing's going crazy. We're just gonna project it, right? But again, in a state like Texas, in a state like Pennsylvania, in a state like Florida, where there's just a lot going on, they're going to take their time because they need to know, okay, maybe turnout in Dallas is great, right? Like way above what you think. And there's a lot of blue votes. You can't project it just based off of that. You got to wait and see what is the turnout like in the Panhandle? What is the turnout like in Austin? What's the turnout like in, Laredo? Right? Like we don't really know what these things are going to mean. And so they're going to take their time and wait until they have enough data from all of those places to have enough information to make that decision.
So I had a question. You hear this term a lot, exit polling.
Yeah.
How does that factor in? Is that part of what goes into calling a state, or is that just a separate thing that is like us happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. So exit polling is separate from their projection. So what exit polling is doing is they're trying to get a representative sample of the people coming out of the poll so that they can kind of get an idea of what's going on, right? Now, exit polling is not 100% reliable, right? Now, most polling isn't 100% reliable, obviously, but exit polling, the idea is that they're trying to get a little bit of a glimpse because, like, they don't report votes nationally by race or by gender or et cetera, right? Like this is all information that they gather on their own. And so, it just gets very complicated. But that's not part of the projection process. The only thing that they're basing the projection on is numbers that the states are reporting to the media.
Do you know how that works? So is there like a physical person like at polling locations asking people who they voted for? How does exit polling work? And would that change with COVID?
Yeah. I do believe that there is a big part of it that is, yes, built out of that is built out of physical people being there. And I do imagine that there would be at least some changes in terms of exit polling with that. But I think that it works similar to kind of any other type of polling too. You're going and, you're probably going to make more calls this year than you might have made in previous years. Again, you're just trying to get a representative sample of what's going on. And that's a big process. And that's an inexact science, obviously, but it gives us a really good idea of what happened. You hear these numbers like, again, like 53% of white women voted for Trump, or 70% of Hispanic people voted for Biden, or whatever, right? That's where those numbers are coming from, is trying to get at least some level of representative sample after an election.
Nice. Yeah, thanks for that information, Shahan. And I think something Shahan touched on earlier is President Trump has talked about wanting this to be done the day of, right? Like typically we're up to like what 2 a.m. our time, and then we know who wins, right? They come out, they have that little party going on, and they give their speech. But especially this year, right? It might not be done in a day. That's typically when it's we kind of know, like Shahan mentioned, it takes up to a couple of weeks to actually count all the votes, but especially this year, especially 2020, with all these mail-in votes, right? Like that's going to take extra time. So some of these states might take days and even potentially weeks, because they count all the early voting and all that voting then, right? But they're also seeing people still in lines, right? If you're still in line and it's closed, as long as you're still in line, your vote's still going to count. So things like that can definitely increase the time, and especially this year, I think it won't be that 2 a.m. call.
Yeah, and something else to know is that different states have different rules about how they count things. So, for example, in the state of Texas, as soon as early voting closes, then they start counting everything that they've done during early voting and mail-in voting. In the state of Florida, they count mail-in ballots as soon as they come in. Other states require you to wait until Election Day to start counting early votes and mail-in ballots. So that's something that we're going to see in the state of Pennsylvania, which, like I mentioned, is a critical state, arguably the critical state of this election from a Trump perspective. And so what you're going to see is that they're going to be a little behind. They're going to be a little later counting than everybody else. You're going to start seeing all these numbers. And one thing too, that just when you're watching on these screens, and hopefully, I assume that the TV networks will do a good enough job of explaining this, but if they don't, one thing to know is that, look, in certain states, we're going to see this big bump of early votes get factored in early, and it's going to skew the numbers. It's going to make things look different than they are, right? So, for example, in the state of Texas, there's a lot of data to show that Democrats are voting early and more Republicans will vote on election day. So what that'll mean is that a lot of the early results will be very Democratic, whereas a lot of the later arriving results might be more Republican. So if you see good numbers in one direction or another at the very beginning, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. We don't necessarily know what that means. So you really want to be patient. You really don't want to get caught up in the, 1 minute after the polls close, because we just don't necessarily know how the information is going to go after that.
And those news outlets are taking this into account, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So what will happen most likely, and this is where I'm saying, like, they need to make sure that they're explaining, is that what they'll probably do is, again, you have John King goes over to his smartboard or whatever and puts this in. He'll probably get, okay, 30% precincts reporting, but like it'll just be the early vote numbers to start potentially, right? And so you might only get that information first, and they might put that up on the board. We don't know how they're going to handle it. But we're hoping obviously that they're going to wait and be patient and not give too much of the early voting as sort of its own thing. We're hoping that obviously they'll kind of roll things together, but it can get very confusing because, again, you might see like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden, these votes came in and all of a sudden what looked red suddenly turns blue, or vice versa. And actually that's something that President Trump has talked about is, for example, a lot of Democrats have said that they're going to mail-in vote or absentee ballot, right? And so one thing that a lot of people I think are worried about is that if you do the single day in-person voting, it could skew very red, but then once you factor in the mail-in ballots, it could go further blue, and that would be something that President Trump would potentially try to use to call everything into question, right? So it's going to be really complicated. Again, if you're watching all the results come in, I implore you to be patient, because that's really the only way that this is going to go. And we really, really, really might not have results on an election night, and that's something that we have to be okay with.
Right. So speaking of misinformation, I did have two things that I saw in the news recently that I did want to talk about. So one was that there was somebody criticizing Joe Biden for having a transition team already. I just wanted to let everyone know this is a perfectly normal thing. Trump made his transition team. He started in May of 2016. This is like perfectly normal. As soon as you get the nomination, you need to start planning for transition because
Right.
it's just part of the process.
Right.
Right. So I did see that one piece of misinformation. The next thing I saw was there in the I think it was 18 election, someone on Twitter went and claimed that they shredded a bunch of ballots. And this spread like wildfire all over Twitter. So I just want to implore you guys, please do not fall for any of these false claims. Obviously, Twitter, Facebook, these companies, they do say that they try to do their best to mitigate it, but there is no proper way to like fully mitigate false information. So just be wary of what you read.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I mean, I'm signed up to be a poll worker on election day, right? I had to go through a whole training to learn how to do all that stuff. And one of the things that they're really clear about is that, man, you are constantly around other people when this stuff is happening, right? Like there's really no points where it's just kind of you with the ballots, right? That's not how any of this works. And so, this idea that, first of all, this idea that anybody in an individual location has enough power to kind of gain access to your ballot and throw it away, like that just doesn't happen that way. And the other thing too is that, there are people of all political orientations serving as poll workers in this place. And so they are not going to they don't even really have the ability to do something about it, right? Like all this stuff goes through the system before we can even do anything about it. And so look, mistakes happen, things happen. I mean, sometimes things get filed wrong, but like the other thing too is that whenever this stuff does happen, there's a reason that you hear about it. And it's because they do a really, really, really good job of tracking this stuff. And they do a really good job of making sure that ballots are counted, because in most states, if not every state, whenever you have a mail-in ballot, they'll track it using a barcode. So you can know when it's counted. You know that it's counted. And so they do a lot of tracking just to make sure that all this stuff happens correctly. And so really, I mean, I know that it's a scary time, but like we have to trust this process. We do, because
we got to all be the 76ers.
we all got to trust the process. And again, like it's going to suck at times. And look, I'll tell you what, I would absolutely love at 7:30 p.m. Central Time on election day to be like, it's fucking over, right? Like we know who's going to win everything, but that's just not how this works. And we need to go into this election, which is going to be a very competitive election, a historic election in a lot of ways. And we got to know that there's a lot of steps that need to be followed before we know what the answer is going to be. So we might not get that fun moment at 10 p.m. where, I remember getting the notification that Obama was elected and being like, it happened. This is so exciting. We probably won't get that on election night because of all the things that are going on, right? And so we need to be okay with that. And you need to also tell other people around you that this is normal.
Right. Okay. I got one last question for you. It's kind of an important one. All right. It's actually a two-parter. All right. So first, what is a lame duck president? And second, do you think Donald Trump has the best duck face of any president?
I'm going to ignore that second part of the question. But the
Wait, are you not saying that Trump has an immaculate duck face? Okay, like I think this is something that we can all agree on.
I'm going to ignore the second half of that question. But so a lame duck president is somebody who has been either voted out, or the alternative to is somebody who knows that their term's going to finish, right? And so for example, if President Trump were to not be reelected and we get the results during that period, he would be a quote unquote lame duck president at that moment. Now, to be clear, he still has all the power being president. Like the presidency stretches all the way until January 19th, and then on January 20th, the transition of power happens, hopefully. And so, that is something that you need to know is like, just because, same deal with Obama back in 2016, right? He was still fully president up until January 19th, 2017. And what that does mean too is that, Congress does get put in earlier. than the president. So, for example, I think it's like January 3rd, you start seeing new congressmen and new senators and all those people being added to the new Congress, and that new session starts. So, like, there's actually an overlap where the prior president is still in place when you have a new Congress, too. So that's kind of the whole deal, is that, it's when you know that your presidency is about to end.
Yeah, so we've talked about it. This is going to be a crazy year. It's going to be, I think, an amazing year to watch. There's so much going on. And like Sean mentioned, like different states, we've seen so many, communities, registering to vote, right? They've done early voting already. Some of those aren't going to be counted until that day, though, But I think it's going to be a huge turnout. I'm excited to see the results. But quickly, we talked about the ballots. We talked about the presidential race. There's also other races we're going to be watching, right? And those are going to be, who's going to be in the Senate, who's going to be the next congressman or congresswoman, and how does that work, Shahan? How many numbers are we looking at right now, and when does that usually happen, or when are we paying attention to that?
Yeah, this is all happening at the same time, right? So it's going to be a lot of information, and there's so much focus on the presidential race, and it's obvious why. Right? Like, I mean, obviously the president is the one that everybody knows. But actually, I'd argue that the congressional and Senate races are more important than even the presidency. And so, for us, we all live in Texas District 24, which has a very competitive race going on right now between Beth Van Dyne and Candace Valenzuela. And this was actually seen as one of the most likely districts to flip. It's been a Republican district for 16 years. And so, for us, what we're going to be watching from a congressional perspective is, there's a lot of battleground races in Texas, especially, right? I mean, there's obviously Texas 24, like I mentioned. Texas 3 is going to be a very interesting one. That's like the Plano district. Texas 22 is going to be interesting. That's like Sugar Land in the Houston area. There's a couple in Central Texas to watch. There's one on the border, Texas 23, that's going to be really interesting. So just from a statewide perspective, that's going to be something interesting to watch, is to figure out what the state wants. And then nationally, so far right now, the Democrats have control of Congress, but every 2 years, every single election cycle, both presidential and midterms, Congress is up, right? Like, they have to get elected every 2 years to stay in office. And so that can be, that can be a lot. You're going to see some people fall who you didn't think were going to fall. And in one fell swoop, you can lose the majority in the House of Congress and lose your speakership and lose the majority and minority party, right? Like, that's stuff that happens. And from a Senate perspective, only a couple of seats are up every year. So I think it's like 16 or 17 that are up this year.
I think it's 33, 35, actually.
Yeah, it's around 30s, in the 30s. Because
Okay.
a third of them are up.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
And sorry, just so you
I'm
mentioned
thinking
earlier,
Yeah.
you said Congress. I assume you meant House of Representatives.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But Congress is usually used as
I
referring to the House of Representatives. But yes,
Yeah.
the House of Representatives specifically. And so with the Senate, a third of the senators are up every 2 years, basically, so that they're not kind of competing all at the same time. So in the state of Texas, we have John Cornyn up right now. He's running against MJ Hagar. That's going to be one to watch. And so the Republicans currently hold the Senate right now. And there's going to be a lot of competitive races to watch. So some of them to watch would be Colorado, seen as a state that could potentially flip. Cory Gardner's running against John Hickenlooper. In Arizona, we've got Mark Kelly running against Martha McSally, who was appointed as senator after John McCain's death, I believe it was. And, there's going to be a couple of others. Georgia actually has 2 races going on at the same time because they have both a special election because the senator retired and also their usual Senate seat as well. And so with that, again, there's going to be a lot going on at the same time, but you're kind of looking to see, same like what I was talking about, trying to get to 270 with the presidency. With the House, you're trying to get to half of that. I got to do some quick math here right now because I think it's 435 House representatives that we're at. So whatever more than half of that is. And then the flip side for the Senate, you're trying to get to 51 votes. I will say, though, in the Senate, the deciding votes, if it's a 50-50 Senate, is actually cast by the vice president. Yeah. So if you win the presidency but only have a 50-50 Senate, you still can have a majority in that House, and vice versa. If you have a 50-50 and there's, the other party, then that party does hold effectively a majority. So there's a lot of talk at this point that the Democrats could flip the Senate, and obviously the presidency's up for grabs. And really, right, like obviously, the three of us here are all, fairly progressive, and so for us, right, like I know that for some of us it can be very attractive to say, well, what if we just elected the most progressive president and that was the end of it, right? But the reality is, if we don't elect people in all of these branches of government, none of this matters, right? Like we had Obama, who was, a pretty progressive president, but he only had a majority in the House and Senate for basically a year and a half. And it was his first year and a half. And you saw once 2010 hit and everything flipped, it kind of was over for him, right? Like he couldn't really pass any policy or legislation after that. So this is why this is so important. And the flip side of that too is, we saw in Trump's first 2 years, he was kind of able to do whatever he wanted, whereas it became a lot harder once the Democrats had the ability to have a voice in the House of Representatives. So being able to hold the House, the Senate, and the presidency is a really valuable thing. And so it takes a lot of legwork for us to be able to do that. So that's something that really needs to be a priority for Democratic voters.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, all 435 seats, right? They're open, right? And that makes such a big difference. Sean said it seemed more important, but point being, it's just as important as the presidential race. You just need, we're hoping for, 218 plus, right? That gives you the majority, but that makes such a difference because the way the government works, I mean, the president, relies on the House of Representatives and the Senate, right? Like things don't get done as quickly or as easily if, we're on different parties. So that's why it's important this year. Good thing to watch, and also something to be knowledgeable about when you go to do your voting, right? Like this makes a huge difference, more than you could even think. And yeah, did you have something to say, Jeff?
Oh yeah, I was just saying too. If you're a voter on either side and the Senate doesn't look like the way you particularly want, definitely don't be discouraged. Look, the Senate, you may have a chance to vote in 2 years for a new senator, and the Senate's just gonna lag behind because it's a 6-year term. It's the longest of the terms, right? The House is gonna flip the fastest, then the presidency, then the Senate. That's just the way it works.
Yeah, and actually one more thing that I want to mention quickly, because it gets no attention nationally versus all this other stuff, is that one of the most valuable things that we can actually do in the state of Texas is we can actually flip the Texas State House. So when you go to vote, don't just vote for the president and your senator and your congressman. Vote all the way down the ticket, right? And obviously research and find the candidates that you feel like you align with the most. But, for us, being generally Democratic voters, here's the deal, right? 2020, in every 10 years, this is the most important election of the whole decade. And I'm not just saying that like as like a wild, like, oh, every election's important thing, right? Like I'm saying specifically in the state of Texas, every 10 years is the most important. And the reason for that is the census. So every 10 years, we have a census and we learn, okay, we have this many people living in each of these states, right? And so they reapportion everything. So they
where in the states they live.
Right. And so they create new congressional districts and they change things up based on what the census says. So there's exactly 435 members of Congress every single time. It doesn't matter how the population's changed. If all of a sudden, like, for example, in the state of Texas, we're projected to gain 3 new congressional districts, and other states will lose them because they lost population or didn't grow as quickly, right? So here's the deal. You might have heard of the term gerrymandering. So what that means is that whenever every 10 years, whenever we have a census, we come together and we redraw the lines of all of the districts, right? That's what happens. That's how these districts are formed. And whichever party is in power of the state house of that state draws those lines, which you might think, wow, that's a really bullshit system. Wouldn't they just draw it so that it helps their party? And the answer is fucking yes. They absolutely would. And so, for example, right, in the year 2010, Democrats lost the House of Representatives in a pretty big landslide, and so a lot of House districts flipped. So what that meant was that in 2010, Republicans were able to redraw everything to their advantage. Well, it's 2020 now, and obviously there's a pretty good chance that the Democrats are in a good spot in a lot of these states. So right now, in the state of Texas, there's actually a really good chance. No, I don't want to say a really good chance. There is a chance that the Democrats could flip the state house. And what that would mean is that they could redraw districts so that it doesn't sort of disproportionately help Republicans as much. They'll be able to do it in a way where we'll have more equitable representation where, I mean, one thing that I've heard, right, is that there's a pretty good chance that one of the districts that's added to the state of Texas will be in North Texas where we live. And there's a lot of thought that, an area like Irving, that's obviously so diverse and, lots of Asian people, lots of Hispanic people, lots of Black people, that could potentially be the site of a new district. So we could be in a position where we're adding a South Asian district, basically, right? Because of the way that Texas is growing. This is the sort of stuff that's up for grabs that people don't really think about. And obviously on top of that, right? Like so much legislation happens at the state level that we don't really think about. It's like we focus all this on what Trump is doing and what the Senate is doing and what Nancy Pelosi is doing. But like a lot of the real work that happens nationally happens in state houses. So having control of the Texas State House would be a huge step towards, furthering our goals in the state of Texas.
Most definitely. And I think that's something, Sean's touched on these past few weeks or months, really, it's just, it's so important to be involved and be knowledgeable about everything going on because it does make a difference, right? It starts from here. It starts out from the ground up. So it's not just the president, we've talked about a couple of things, but, everything's in our control. And it's so important to realize that and what a difference it makes. Real quickly.
And can I say something there? We talked about a lot on this podcast about a little bit of our personal opinions. Like all of us are progressive leaning, but if you're listening to this podcast and you're a Republican, you're more conservative leaning, we strongly encourage you to still go out and vote. Your vote is what matters. And if you feel a certain way, you should vote and you should tell us how you feel.
Yeah, and ultimately, right, the coolest thing about this election, because you look at the numbers and turnout is insane right now. Like it's really insane. And actually, the state of Texas leads the entire nation both in total turnout and also turnout as a percentage of 2016 turnout. We're already more than 82% of the way to our 2016 turnout, and there's a whole nother week
and young voter turnout as well.
And young voter turnout. And on top of that, we actually have had more Asians vote already in this election than we had in all of 2016 already. And so, like, here's the cool part about it,
including one of them on this podcast. Two of them on this podcast, actually.
Because Ryan didn't vote in 2016 either. That's right. And so,
2016.
So here's the deal, right? More than anything, we have an opportunity to actually figure out what this country thinks, because in this country, the most popular voting preference is non-voter. It's not Republican or Democrats. So the more people that come out, the more that we figure out what this country actually wants. We hear all this stuff and we hear about these political groups. We hear about white working class Midwesterners. We hear all this stuff about swing voters and all this stuff, right? But we have no idea what people really want unless they vote. And a lot of people who don't vote are like, well, what's my vote going to count? Well, it's not really about just one person, right? I think that I heard somebody say that, I didn't like, my presidential candidate didn't win, but voting's a team sport, and it is, right? So ultimately, the most powerful bloc in America is people who did not vote before, because they're the people who can come in and change things. So look, maybe we have 100% turnout in Texas, which, 100% is basically impossible, but maybe we have 100% turnout in Texas, and we realize, hey, it was right. This was a Republican state. Well, it's better that we know that than us have all this gerrymandering and have all of this voter suppression to try to make it happen, right? It would be better for the state of Texas to represent the people, even if it's not what we want, than it would be, obviously, in this crazy, fucked up system that we have right now.
Yeah, totally. And like Sean touched on, it's all about the younger generations, right? Their votes is what's really changes the whole program. Like, you're not going to see a lot of people affiliated with one party and then flip, right? That's kind of rare to see, unless you're just like, I don't like this one person, so whatever. But like, it's the newer generations, the new votes that actually swing things. So that'll be interesting to see. But like Sean said, it's all about getting your voice heard, right? And you do that by voting. So it's really important. And like Dev mentioned, whether you're Republican or Democrat, just go out there and vote. Make sure everyone's out there voting, because it is your right, right? And you don't want to give that up. One last thing, we'll definitely do like a recap of this whole election process, because we spent so much time on it. But one last thing is the way it ends. Like we said, it might not be the night of, but usually the other candidate concedes, right? They give a call to the other candidate saying, obviously the numbers don't look good for me. I'm not getting to 270, so congrats, and then we get an announcement from the future president. But that's something to look at, especially in this this election, right? Like something that's been brought up that we haven't really heard in the past is about a peaceful transition of power, right? And like Shahan has touched on earlier, like President Trump saying, "Oh, if we wait, the longer we wait, the potential is it could be rigged." Right. And, there is like a recount process in states and things that could happen that could actually delay this process. But that's also something to keep an eye out for because we really don't know. This is a weird thing to say, but we really don't know how this is going to work out and what's going to happen. But it'll be fun to watch, no doubt.
Yeah. And I don't want to be like alarmist, right? Like I don't want to like say that we need to, be worried or scared or anything like that. But truly the best way to avoid all of these questions is to be decisive enough that there's an answer right away, right? That we don't have the ability to get, like in 2000, right? Obviously 2000 is an election that ended up being one of the most fraught in the history of our country. And what ended up happening was it came down to a group of voters in like a couple precincts in Florida where maybe they didn't push in their ballots hard enough, basically, right? And so hopefully that's not going to be a factor here in general. But what ended up happening is that a lot of people's votes might have been invalidated because of it. And obviously, whatever you want to say about whether you like or didn't like Bush, obviously the world is a lot different for George Bush having been president instead of Al Gore. And so here's the deal, right? If you don't want Trump to call into question the election, the best way for that to happen is to vote him out quickly. And same deal with Joe Biden, obviously. I mean, we don't have those same questions about whether there will be a peaceful transition or a peaceful concession or anything like that because
he's not in power.
and also because they are not the same. But we will, if you want Joe Biden to concede and if you want him to kind of go away, the way to do that is to overwhelmingly win to where it's not in question. Because I'll tell you what, I mean, especially in a state like Pennsylvania, where, like I mentioned, the vote totals are going to be coming in more slowly than a lot of other states. The longer it drags on, the less people are going to decide that they're going to concede. They'll wait to see every ballot counted. And, again, in 2000, it stretched all the way into late November and into December before we really knew anything, right? I mean, which is a crazy thing that I really, really, really don't hope does not happen, obviously. But the best way that we can make it happen is to make the election decisive. And for, people like us, that means winning Texas. If Texas goes blue, there is no path for Donald Trump to become president. There's no way for him to call, the election in Pennsylvania illegitimate or anything like that, right? It's over at that point. And so the more decisive the people are, the more likely it is that things will kind of move forward.
Yep, and if Texas went blue, that'd be historic, right? That'd be a huge deal. And like we're just talking about is just, we don't know what could happen, right? Like, we're all live for 2000. We all saw that a Supreme Court had to rule on the Bush versus Gore thing. So like anything could happen. It'll be a fun thing to watch. We hope we all answered your questions. You may have, there's a lot of questions. In case you have any more, always reach out to us. We're ready to discuss about it, and we'll hopefully answer those questions for you. But thank you again for listening to this episode and this podcast. We appreciate it so much. And until next time, we're out. See ya.